This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, good evening, everyone. All right, let's try that one more time. It's a small group, but good evening. Okay, I'm Rita Sheffy. I'm the Assistant Dean for Public Service here at Emory Law School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Interim Dean Jim Hughes and the rest of the faculty, staff, and students of the law school. We were one of the first program partners of the Arc of Justice effort, and I want to thank Derek Pope for getting us involved in this important project and asking us to host this evening. And I give a special welcome to our speaker, Mike Cody, and to our moderator, Rick Deane. We look forward to this first program in a series to highlight the legal efforts associated with one of the most pivotal moments of the civil rights movement. In addition to hosting tonight's inaugural event, we are actively involved with Arc of Justice in other ways. For example, next Monday, Derek will be back here at the law school, meeting with more than a dozen students who have volunteered to research and select cases to create content for a traveling exhibit regarding legal figures associated with the American Civil Rights Movement. And I anticipate that we'll have even more students involved as the project and the organization mature. Our increasing student interest in civil rights was reflected earlier this year in the rejuvenation of our Civil Rights Practice Society, which now has more than 80 students as members and organizes various programs and events of their own during the year. This semester alone, they are coordinating a trip to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights and hosting various speakers, including Chris Stewart, Nora Benavidez, B.J. Bernstein, and Senator Elena Parent. And just a few weeks ago, several of our students launched the Emory LGBTQ Legal Services to provide much-needed legal assistance to LGBTQ individuals in the metro Atlanta area. ELS connects pro bono attorneys and volunteer law students with low-income LGBTQ clients who have legal needs not currently being addressed. But of course, Emory Law has a much broader and deeper focus on civil rights, reflected not only through our courses, programs, and faculty scholarship, but most recently through the creation of the John Lewis Chair for Civil Rights and Social Justice. In 2015, Emory Law received an anonymous $1.5 million donation to help establish the John Lewis Chair, and the law school then committed to raise an additional $500,000 to fund the chair fully, a goal we met last year. So we now will conduct a national search for a scholar with an established academic profile of distinction and a demonstrated desire to promote the rule of law through the study of civil rights. The chair's work will focus on areas where racial discrimination persists in our environment and will examine issues such as the restriction of voting rights, racial dimensions of mass incarceration in the United States, and the treatment of undocumented immigrants. These are all very exciting efforts with much more to come as we enter our second century of advancing the rule of law. And again, I thank you all for being here and welcome you to Emory Law School. Derek?
Thank you, Rita. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to Hidden Legal Figures, Conversations with the Unsung. My name is Derek Alexander Pope, and I'm President and Managing Director of the Arc of Justice Institute. And on behalf of our Board of Directors and its Chair, the Honorable Judge M. Yvette Miller, we're delighted that you're here with us this evening in what I can guarantee you will be an unforgettable experience. The civil rights movement has been characterized in a variety of ways, but the best description that fits our occasion this evening came from University of Chicago law professor Harry Calvin Jr. when he said it was the first revolution in history conducted on the advice of counsel. Now, the generals, the lieutenants, the foot soldiers of that revolution are very familiar to us, but the legal figures, the ones who provided the advice and the counsel, have remained hidden for far too long. That is, until now. It is the goal of the Arc of Justice Project to correct that oversight. And tonight we take our first step in bringing into plain view the heroic and vital contribution of lawyers and judges to that movement. This evening we have one of those lawyers. W.J. Michael Mike Cody is a partner at Birch, Porter & Johnson in Memphis, Tennessee, the site of one of those battlegrounds. Mr. Cody is a former United States Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee and a former Attorney General for the state of Tennessee. But it was 6 years after graduating from the University of Virginia School of Law that history summoned him to take part in the case known as the City of Memphis versus Martin Luther King Jr. et al., Civil Action Number C-68-80. Also joining us on the stage is, for our moderator, is Mr. Richard H. Deane, Jr., partner in charge of the Atlanta office of Jones Day. Like Mr. Cody, Mr. Deane is also a former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and this proud graduate of the University of Georgia School of Law is also a former United States Magistrate Court judge. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage and on the ark, Richard Deane and Mike Cody.
Hi. Well, thank you all, and Derek, particularly, thank you for that very kind introduction. Rita, thank you for hosting us here. This was a night long in coming. Derek and I spoke some time ago, and I spoke to him a little bit about Mike, and Derek just, you could see his face light up as he could sort of see the potential. And lo and behold, we are here tonight. My goal in all of this is to not get in the way. Mike's story is a compelling story, and my hope is to perhaps facilitate, but really to let him speak and tell you the story that I've heard him give on more than one occasion. But every time I hear it, it's just as captivating when I hear it the third or fourth time as it was the first time that I ever heard it. And the result of many audiences hearing Mike's story of his representation of Dr. King has led him to be on the speaking circuit perhaps more than he ever thought he would be, because every time someone hears it, there's a clamor to get him to do it some other place. So Mike, welcome. We're awfully glad to have you here in Atlanta as a part of the Arc of Justice program. I'll begin by asking, if I could, to tell us a little bit about your life as a child. You grew up in Memphis, and what I'd like to do is sort of set the tone of what your life was like, focusing in particularly on how you came to understand and recognize segregation.
How much time do we have? I don't want anybody to miss their supper. And before I get to that, don't anyone believe Derek's presentation. I was a young lawyer in Memphis when I got a call to be involved with Dr. King, but I knew it was above my pay grade. But I had a lawyer that was right across the hall from me that had brought me to Memphis and to work in civil rights. And he was the lawyer that we needed, and I got him. And so you'll see another picture later on when my role was I was carrying his books. So anytime we talk about lawyers, and I look at this more as a witness than as really as a lawyer to a couple of days in history. But that's not the question that Rich asked me to start with. I grew up in Memphis. I was born in 1936. I'll be 82 next month. And when you think about it, and I hadn't thought about this until this date sort of appeared quickly on my horizon. When I was born in 1936, it was only 70 years after slavery. And so since 36, I've lived longer this direction from my birth than going back from my birth to slavery and the Civil War. And in Memphis, in the 30s and the 40s, 50s, 60s, particularly in those earlier years, Memphis was locked down segregation. And someone asked me, well, what did you think about that? Well, you didn't think anything about it. It's just the way it was. Nobody raised any questions about it. My folks never said a ugly word or expressed anything about a person of color or their economic class that I ever heard in any way was ugly, but they were complete segregationists because the system was that way. There was no way to escape it. So I grew up in that kind of community. And I'll just mention a couple of little things that at least pricked my mind about segregation and the life that we lived there in the South and in Memphis. And first thing happened, I was in the 6th grade, and the teacher at the end of the school year said, bring your school books out and put them on the playground, stack them up, geography books, science books, math books, English books in rows, and so we did. These are books that had been used for 3 or 4 years there at the school. We'd spilt Coke on them, we'd written in them, we'd tore pages out of them, and they weren't in really very good shape. And as I walked away from that stack of books, I asked my teacher, I said, what happens to these books when we're through with them here? He said, well, when we're through with them, they then go to the black schools, and they'll use them for 3 or 4 years, and then they'll be discarded. Now, I didn't say anything, do anything, but for the first time, it seemed like that wasn't exactly fair, not to have new books or books that were better than these books we were putting on the playground. And then next time I'm aware of anything that's challenging this system to me, and again, I wasn't any civil rights leader, didn't do anything about it. I was running track at high school, public school, and the word sort of floated out in the high school community that on Sunday afternoon at a place called Hodges Field, where they had a track, there was going to be a track meet, and some black kids were going to show up with the white kids to run against each other. And of course, that was against the law at the time. There weren't going to be coaches there, no officials. And so that afternoon, the kids from the white schools, let's say there's Central, Messick, Tech, East High, South Side, we came over the wall. And at the same time, the kids from Booker T. Washington, Carver, Melrose, Manassas, they came over the other wall. And we had us a track meet. Again, absolutely illegal, but there's nobody there but kids, so it didn't matter. And so we ran, I'll just use the 100 and the 200, or back in those days it was a 100-yard dash, the 220 and the 440 before the meters. And so we ran the 100-yard dash, and the guy who was the state record holder, a white guy, in the 100-yard dash, when it was over, he finished 3rd. We did the 220, and the guy who held the state record, white kid, finished 2nd. We did the 400, same way. And so in each of those races, a black kid had won the race. But then on Monday morning, the next day, the white kids were still the state record holders because the black kids weren't recognized at all in the record books or as even being worthy of having those records. And it occurred to me that day that was not only fair to the black kids who weren't getting the recognition that they deserved, but it wasn't fair to the white runners either because we weren't exposed to the best competition we could have had in an unsegregated society. And so I graduated and went on to college and then off to law school. But those were the sort of first inclinations that I had that something wasn't right about the system that I'd grown up in.
Mike, tell us a little bit about your parents. You said that you were raised in a setting that you never heard. Certainly it was a segregated setting, as you've already mentioned. But tell us a little bit about your parents.
Well, they were, I think they were good people. My father had what you'd call, he never went to college. I was one of the first people in my family, immediate family, that ever got to go to college. And he was modest. He was a fisherman. He worked for the Standard Oil Company as a bookkeeper, kind of a job. My mother was just a housewife. And again, when I never would have gone to college, or at least I wouldn't have gone before I went into the Army, but for the fact that I was running. And so my school, my East High School, we didn't have a track. We had a football field, but didn't have a track around it. And so my coach would put me on the back of his motorcycle and take me over to Rhodes College in Memphis, where they did have a track, and I would work out. And I began to work out with the college kids and was doing okay. And one day the track coach came up to me and said, "Son, where are you going to college?" And I said, "Well, I don't guess I'm going to go to college because my folks don't have any money, and I'm hoping I'll go in the Army or whatever, and after that maybe I'll have enough money to go to college." And he said, "Well, how would you like to come here to school?" I said, "Well, it'd be all right, but you'd have to pay me to come." And he said, "Well, we don't have any athletic scholarships, Division III school, but in high school, did you ever do anything but run?" And so I said, "Well, I did a little student government stuff, things like that." And he said, "Well, let me see what I can do." So make a long story short, he got me a scholarship to go to college. And it was then, as I became at that college, it was an earth change, sea change for me, because among other things, after my sophomore year, I got a scholarship to go live in England for the summer with a bunch of other students. And that experience was the first time that I'd ever seen a peer, a student my age, that was black. And all of a sudden, I was seeing people that were smarter than I was, going to better schools, getting degrees, talking better than I talked. And that was so counter to the way I had been brought up, because I'd had none of those experiences. And the next summer, I was president of the student body, and they invited me to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to go to a National Student Association meeting, a Congress. And that was like 2 years after Brown versus Board of Education had been decided in 1954. And we were talking about desegregation and things of that sort. But again, I was thrown with black students who were government leaders and editors of the newspapers in those colleges, and it gave me an awareness of a world that didn't exist in just Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, you started to go into how you'd end up going to law school. How did that come about?
Well, you keep bringing me back to the track, Rick. I guess it was April of 1957. 58. I graduated in May of 58, so this is April of 58 from college, and I was walking back, and the track sprint coach was a guy who also was the head of the International Studies Department. And he said, kind of like this coach 4 years earlier, he said, "Cody, what are you going to do when you graduate from college?" And I said, "Well, I've got a fellowship to go to Duke and get a PhD in political science, and I'm going to be a college professor, teach." He said, "Well, that sounds great. Why do you want to do that?" And I said, "Well, I've seen you guys. You look like it's a great life being a professor." And he said, "Well, but what if you go get a PhD, that takes 2 or 3 years or more, and you decide you don't like to teach. I said, well, that'd be a problem. He said, well, let me, you can see how malleable I was. This is a coach telling me. He said, well, why don't you do this with your life? Why don't you go to law school? That way, after 3 years of law school, if you want to teach, you can teach in law school. And if you want to practice law, you can practice law. You keep all those options open. So, so I immediately changed directions and I got my girlfriend to write a bunch of letters of applications, and not to graduate school, but to law school, and among others, Virginia gave me enough money to go to law school, so that's what I did.
Well, everybody wants to hear, and the reason I'm sure many of the people came out this evening, they want to hear the story of how someone like you ended up representing Dr. King at such a critical point in his life. And when I say someone like you, when I say that, I'm referencing your I'm referencing your early childhood, and then your time through school and the like. But you had a crossroads with history, and that's a story that everybody would like to hear.
Well, after Virginia law school, I turned down a job at a large firm in Philadelphia because this guy, Lucius Birch, who I had clerked for the summer between my second and third year, said he didn't think I wanted to go to Philadelphia, and he needed me to come back to Memphis because things were happening in Memphis that were important. I could not only make a good living here, but I could also be involved in making changes in the community. And by that time, I had seen enough to be aware that there were changes that needed to be made. And so in December 1961, I came back to Memphis after a short time in the Army and went to work for him. And he was involved at that time in integrating libraries, the parks, department stores, public facilities, lunch counters. And so I began to work with him as he was doing that, and that naturally moved me into the area of the American Civil Liberties Union. And I became involved in their work. We talk about the Freedom Summer. We do little things like a kid coming down from school in New York or Connecticut or Massachusetts or Chicago to work in Mississippi. They'd bring a car through Memphis and we'd swap it out, and we'd take the New York tag car and give them a Memphis car because it was safer to drive a Memphis car in Mississippi than a New York car. And at the same time, there were students that were getting expelled from schools for demonstrating, and so I was active in that and became chairman of the American Civil Liberties Union Tennessee office, and then eventually was on the board in New York of the American Civil Liberties Union. So when the strike happened,
The garbage strike.
the sanitation strike in Memphis in the spring of 1968, they had a march in the month of March, toward the end of March, and Jim Lawson, who was a Memphis minister and a friend of mine, was in charge of those demonstrations, and it was going nowhere. They weren't getting off the ground. The city refused to recognize the union, refused to bargain with them, wouldn't listen to anything about a memorandum of understanding, and consequently, it was dead in the water. And so Jim Lawson called his friend, Dr. King, in Atlanta. Jim had been a divinity student at Vanderbilt, and he had gotten kicked out when he organized the lunch counter strikes there, or sit-ins, and they all got arrested. And so Vanderbilt Divinity School kicked him out of Divinity School, and he went up to Boston and met Dr. King, and he had studied under Gandhi, and he and Dr. King became fast friends, mainly on civil disobedience. And so Dr. King came to Memphis that day. He hadn't organized the march himself. SCLC hadn't been the planners of it. And so as it walked off toward Main and Beale Street there in Memphis, a bunch of kids in the back of the march who didn't buy into the nonviolence. Their heroes were Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael and Black Panthers in California. And so they didn't buy into the nonviolent techniques of Dr. King, and he didn't want to include them in the leadership of the march. Jim Lawson didn't. So they tore the placards off of the sticks and began to break windows out along the march there in stores. And when they did that, the police overreacted. I was in that march and tear gassed everyone. People began looting. People were killed. And Dr. King was taken from that scene of danger back to his hotel, which at that time was a place called the Rivermont Hotel. It wasn't the Lorraine Motel. And Dr. King came back and he called a press conference and said, I'll be back to Memphis and I'll lead a march which we will plan, and it'll be successful and get results for these, the poorest of the workers in Memphis. Now, you have to remember that in the summer of 1968, King was planning what was called the Poor People's March, where he was going to bring people from all over the country to Washington, and they were going to sit in tents and bring them there in wagons and whatever, and demonstrate until Congress acted on economic justice issues. And Andy and Abernathy and the others didn't want him to come to Memphis and get diverted to this little sanitation garbage strike and take away from the planning that they were having. But Dr. King said, if I can't come to Memphis and lead a march and be successful for the poorest workers in Memphis, I'll never get off the ground in Washington. So once Dr. King announced that he was coming back, the city attorney went to federal court and got an injunction, a temporary restraining order, to prevent Dr. King from coming.
What were some of the conditions, the working conditions, that sort of compelled Dr. King to see this as something that he just felt that he had to participate in?
Well, it started as a wildcat strike, a labor strike, and I'll just mention probably two of the main things that triggered it. The first one was a rule that the city had that if it rained on a day so hard that you couldn't go out from the lot and pick up garbage, that everybody took off for that day, and the supervisors and the drivers who were white got paid for the day, but the garbage workers did not get paid for the day. And that was one of the issues. But probably the sort of lightning strike issue was there were two men that were sitting on the back of a garbage truck eating their lunch. They had their sack lunch. And someone was inside the car, inside the cab of the truck, and hit the compactor. And it came down and crushed and killed both of those men sitting on the back of the truck. And it became obvious that they had no benefits, no insurance, no nothing, and they didn't even have money. They had to collect money to bury these men. And so the men walked off. And that was just one of the, you have to remember, this is 50 years ago. And today, I don't know what it's like in Atlanta, but in Memphis, when it's Thursday and time to pick up the garbage, we've got our little buggies, and we take our recycle and our garbage, and we put it in little plastic sacks and put it there, and we push the buggy out to the street, and the truck comes by, and it hooks up to the buggy and flips it in the container, and buggy comes back, and at the end of the day, we push the empty buggy back. But in those days, the garbage man would come to your house, and he'd walk either through the alley or through the driveway, And he would go through your garbage can, which was at that time a big galvanized garbage bucket. And he would pick the garbage out and he'd put it in his tub, which was a tin tub. And it might be liquid waste, it might be food, whatever it was. And the tubs that they had leaked, and he'd put it on his shoulder and he'd have to carry it to the truck and empty it out. So at the end of the day, he was covered in waste, and he had to ride the bus home. They didn't have any showers, they didn't have any uniforms, and it was just a very degrading situation for these workers. Yeah. It was a very bad situation.
You started to talk a little bit about the circumstances after the first march that Dr. King didn't organize, and it ended in a riot. What was the next? Dr. King committed to coming back to Memphis.
Dr. King committed to coming back to Memphis, and they set it up for the first part of April 1968. And so this time, when he was to come back to Memphis, arrangements had been made for him to stay at the Lorraine Motel, which in previous years was the only place they could have stayed in Memphis, the only place that blacks could stay in a hotel in Memphis for years just before that time. And so he announced that he was coming back, and the city got this temporary restraining order. Well, that's when I came into play. Derek presented as if it was I was chosen. The only reason I was chosen is I was the only lawyer in Memphis that the ACLU knew, because I was bored and all. And so it wasn't it's like somebody picking a lawyer out of the telephone book today. But Mel Wolfe, and who was in New York, the legal director of the ACLU, and a guy named Charles Morgan, who originally was from Birmingham, but left Birmingham when the church was blown up. He made a speech to the Chamber of Commerce in Birmingham and burned all of his bridges with the legal community. He was so outraged by the death of these children, which, as you know, in today's history, Doug Jones eventually convicted those Klan members that blew that church up. But Mel and Chuck got me on the phone and said, Dr. King's going to march in the face of this federal injunction, and we don't want it to happen. Dr. King had violated a lot of state court injunctions in Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, wherever it happened to be, and took no notice of it. But here he was threatening to violate a federal court injunction, and to the NAACP and the ACLU, that would be a terrible thing to do, because the federal courts had been the bulwark of the support and backbone of the whole civil rights movement, whether it was school seat desegregation or what it was, and they wanted us to get that injunction lifted. And so I told Chuck that we would do it, because I was sure this guy who had kept me from going to Philadelphia to make a lot of money and to come here to Memphis to work with him on civil rights wouldn't bat an eye. So I walked over across the aisle to Mr. Birch, and I said, ACLU wants us to represent Dr. King. And he said, well, I want two things to happen. I didn't know there were any conditions, but he said, first, I want us to be engaged. I don't want it to look like we're volunteering to do this. I want to be asked to do it in a legal way. So I called Chuck back, and he sent this telegram, which is in my office, which I think is in the materials Derek put out, which asked us to represent Dr. King. And the second thing that Lucius Birch asked was, he said, I want to sit down and meet with Dr. King and have him convince me that this is important enough for us to get engaged and to do it. You know, he didn't say this, but at the time, as you know, Dr. King didn't have a national holiday. J. Edgar Hoover thought he was a communist. He was not at all popular in the Memphis community, and we represented the Illinois Central Railroad, banks, insurance companies that would, they were not too keen on their lawyer doing this kind of work. But Bert said, if Dr. King thinks it's important, we'll do it. And so I called back, and they said, well, Dr. King and his group from SCLC are on their way to Memphis, and we'll set it up for you to meet this afternoon. That's the afternoon of April the 3rd with Dr. King at the Lorraine Motel. So this is later on the afternoon of April 3. They're walking into the room where we're sitting, waiting for them to come in. And Dr. King has just been served with a temporary restraining order by the federal marshal down in the parking lot below this second floor balcony. And so that's Abernathy and Dr. King, and then Jim Lawson, who I've mentioned, who was the local minister in charge of the strike. And so we go in there for an hour or two and meet with Dr. King in the room that he and Abernathy had. It's sort of a surreal kind of experience. The suits, the lawyers are sitting on one twin bed, knee to knee with Dr. King and Andy Young and Jim Lawson and Jesse Jackson and Ralph Abernathy. Well, Abernathy wasn't sitting down. I remember he was eating fried chicken behind the bed. He wasn't sitting down. But, again, to sort of emphasize what my role was, in that meeting, I just watched Dr. King and Andy Young and Lucius Birch talk about why this was so important and to decide that we would represent him. And that meeting went on, and then some of the lawyers went back to the office to draw up the papers, to put the injunction at issue. And my job was to try to talk to Andy Young and Jim Lawson, who were going to be our witnesses. We weren't going to let Dr. King testify in court. We were going to let Andy speak for him. And I talked to Andy like, y'all, I just assume everybody in Atlanta knows who Andy Young is.
Safe assumption.
When Andy was there, he was just a young guy like me. He wasn't ambassador to the UN or mayor of Atlanta, whatever else he became. But we decided that Andy would speak for Dr. King and for SCLC and the other SCLC defendants. And so we were preparing those papers, and I stayed around to talk with Jim and Andy. And Dr. King was to make that final speech himself at the Mason Temple.
Tell us a little bit about how that came about, because you were present just before he left to go give the speech.
Again, and I want to try to be, I don't know when, I know I went to the speech. Mm-hmm. Now, when I left where Dr. King was and where Andy and Jim and I were, I can't remember, but I do know either from Jim or from Andy or I was there that King sent Abernathy over to make this speech because he was exhausted. He had a bad cold, and he asked Abernathy to go make the speech. And Abernathy went over there, and the church was packed with sanitation workers and their families and union people and ministers. And Abernathy called back and said, Dr. King, this isn't my crowd. They're not going to be happy for me to make this speech. You're going to have to come. And it was incredible to me that to hear what turned out to be the last speech of his life, he hadn't planned to make, he didn't want to make, and he may have had a note card, but I didn't even see that. And And he went on over that night to the Mason Temple and made what turned out to be the last speech that he ever made.
Now, what were the circumstances after that? What transpired after Dr. King gave the speech that evening? And this is the speech that everybody would know as the drum major speech.
It was the mountaintop speech.
Oh, I'm sorry, the mountaintop speech
It's a
that has a
mountaintop
drum major in it.
speech. He went over there, and Abernathy introduced him, and I'm not going to read you his speech. You all heard it, and I can't do justice to it. But two things I'll just cover it for those of you who may not have seen it. First, about the injunction, and because I was interested in that, and we were getting ready to go to court, and it put a little pressure on us. King said this. He said, and this is in that last speech, and this was you have to imagine, this was April, but it was a muggy, warm night, and the church was packed with people, of all kinds of people. And there was no air conditioning, but it was very humid, and there were tornadoes coming from Arkansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, into the Memphis area, and a lot of winds and rain, and the rain, they didn't have any air conditioning. They opened the windows up at the top of the church, and there was an old ceiling fan that the wind would blow, and it would sort of clack as it went around. And Dr. King was making this speech and of course, no one knew it was his last speech that he was going to make, but it was a very dramatic speech. And he says this. Now, about injunctions, we have an injunction, and we're going to go to court tomorrow morning to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction. All we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges, because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And so, just as I say, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. We're going on. So you can imagine my hearing that. And we are going to court to get this injunction, which he's not going to pay any attention to one way or the other anyway. And so, again, just the last little paragraph that gives this speech the name that it had, Dr. King said, well, I don't know what will happen now. We got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I thought at the time, I didn't know how to describe what I was seeing, but if you think of these little toys, plastic toys that kids take to the beach that have a little plug in them, if you take that plug out of the toy, all the air comes out of it. And so as I was sitting down at the bottom of the pulpit riser there, and as they helped Dr. King back to the pastor's chair, and he sat down, it was as if all of his energy was went out in that speech. And then ended next morning. I'm taking up too much y'all's time. This is us going into the courtroom on the morning of April the 4th, and that's Jim Lawson, and then Andy Young, and then the only real lawyer in the picture, the guy with the hat on, Mr. Birch, and one of my associates there. But now I want you to pay attention to who looks like he's doing all the work. You know, who's carrying the books, carrying Mr. Birch's umbrella and overcoat. So that was my job that day. So we were in court all day long. City put on its proof about how dangerous this march would be. We put on our proof through Andy Young and Jim about it'd be a lot safer if Dr. King led the march with SCLC doing it right. And we'd actually copied an injunction from Judge Frank Johnson in Alabama about how to have just 6 marchers abreast and communication with the police and no placards on sticks and things like that. And the judge agreed that it would be safer to do that. And he told us, he called us back into chambers and said that he's going to bring him an order and he would sign it the next morning and allow the march to take place under our restrictions. Of course, I took Andy Young back to the Lorraine Motel so he could tell Dr. King that we'd been successful. And before I could go back and get my stuff at the office and driven 3 or 4 miles to my home, the radio announced that Dr. King had been shot. It didn't say first he'd been killed because the police knew what reaction that would cause, but it said he'd been shot, but he was obviously dead when he was hit the ground. So that was sort of the end of the story. Afterwards, we had the march. It was an absolute silent march. Complete.
Well, wasn't there an encounter where the police came to get you to take you back to the hotel?
Well, I forgot that part of the night. As you know, all across the country, Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., maybe Atlanta, I don't know, people were so angry and bitter that riots broke out around the urban areas of America. And it would have been really bad in Memphis if people like Dr. Ben Hooks and Andy Young and Jim Lawson hadn't immediately got on the radio and television and said, the worst thing that you can do in Memphis to dishonor Dr. King is to engage in violence, because his whole life was about nonviolence and against violence. And they kept, to a great extent, some of the worst parts of the riots in other places from happening in Memphis. But it was serious. And the police told me that there were some kids that had gotten up in the top of the Claiborne Temple, which was the strike headquarters, and they had paving stones, and they were throwing them out the window at the police, and the police were going to go in there with tear gas and run them out. And the police were afraid if that happened, it would just escalate the violence. And so they asked me to go down and find Jim Lawson, who would talk the kids out of the church peacefully. And so they came out to my house and picked me up, and we went with the blue lights going and the siren and whatever back down to this area. And looking back on it, it's kind of funny, but it wasn't funny at the time. We came to a stop, and there were 2 officers in the front of the car, passenger and the driver, and they got out and opened my door. I was in the back, and I got out of the car, and they shut my door, and the officer who had opened my door got back on the passenger side, and they drove away. And so I'm dressed like this, and I'm looking around, and there are liquor stores being broken into. Things are on fire. The firemen are trying to hose out the fires. There's looting going on. And for the first time in this few days anyway, I felt some danger to myself because I sort of looked like the enemy. But I found a newspaper reporter who found Jim Lawson. Jim talked the kids out of the church and the newspaper guy got me a ride home.
Did the march take place?
The march took place. This is the march organizing there. You see the young-looking lawyer there in the suit over there on the side looking with the armband on. I had to be a marshal in the march, and so that's us getting ready to start the march. There I am sort of, you see the movie was The Graduate that's being shown there, and I'm walking across the street right behind the three people, and the first guy's the head of the FBI, guy named Holloman. And then as the march came up toward where we were going to assemble, this is another picture of me with my marshal band on. You wouldn't recognize me, of course, looking at me now, looking at me then. And you can see back there, though, that's Harry Belafonte and Dr. Spock. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember Dr. Spock. And Ms. King is there next to Abernathy, and the King children are there. And then Andy Young is behind the police officer in the white shirt. That's Andy. And we're walking up Main Street. And as the march comes, we numbered that's Jim Lawson is number 1. Harry Belafonte's back there, number 3. And Dr. King's daughter and sons, and then Ms. King, and then Abernathy and Andy Young over there on the other side, and that was the end of the march there on Ms. King had the funeral here in Atlanta, and then she came back and led that march on what I guess would have been April 8th. And it was a peaceful march, as Dr. King had promised it would be.
So, Mike, how did this impact the rest of your life?
Well, of course, you think back, it would have had very little impact on any of us if Dr. King had not been killed. It would have just been another court appearance in a civil rights case. But, I hate to say it, just like I suspect in Dallas, when John Kennedy was killed, people in Dallas were sort of sorry John Kennedy was killed, but they were more sorry he was killed in Dallas. And that was the same, I think, in a lot of people in Memphis. They were embarrassed that Dr. King had been killed in Memphis and didn't sort of remember why he had to come to Memphis in the first place. But people started coming together, and, Dr. King had written a book the year before this, 1967, called Where Do We Go From Here? It's a marvelous book. If you hadn't read it, it is so prophetic. But we began to think, and Jim Lawson and I, Jim had gotten me into all kinds of bad things. He had me protesting the Vietnam War and a lot of things that made people uncomfortable a little bit. But I was talking to Jim. I said, what do we do? And Jim said, well, you have to start somewhere. And he said, these garbage workers, not only did they not have enough to eat, they were on food stamps, they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have a living wage, their families didn't have anything to help them in life, and they can't get lawyers. They can't hire a lawyer if they need to sue on a contract or get sued or a divorce or a will, or they can't afford it. You're a lawyer. Why don't we start a legal aid program in Memphis? And I said, well, what do we do? He said, well, you get the lawyers and I'll give you the church. And so I got 35 lawyers, and Jim gave us the Centenary Methodist Church, second floor, on Saturdays, all day Saturday, and after 5 o'clock on weekdays, and we'd send lawyers down there, and we started the Memphis Shelby County Legal Services, which today is a multi-million-dollar operation providing legal services all of West Tennessee. So Jim's idea, I think, is the correct one. You just start somewhere. You just do something. And a lot of people in Memphis began to do that. They set up groups where people could at least experience interracial activities and things. And, you know, Memphis is in pretty bad shape even in 1968. Anyway, I've talked too long. I'm going to lose my voice.
Well, I don't have anything further, Mike. And Derek, I don't know if the format, if you contemplated questions, but Mike, I can't tell you how appreciative we are. Perhaps there are some questions from the audience.
You know, again, in a sense, you can imagine if you're in my case, and Billy Cowles, I don't know whether any of y'all remember Billy Cowles. Billy Cowles was a minister in Memphis that Dr. King was going to his house to have dinner just before he was killed. And Billy did a program for HBO, I think, which is called The Witness. And that's the only, you know, obviously I wasn't much of a lawyer, and I didn't do very much in the scene. And so more and more, I'm just more comfortable being a witness to what I saw in those days, just like others have done. And the federal court on April 5 this year, we're going to have Andy and Jim Lawson are coming back to Memphis, and there are 4 lawyers that are living that were in this, and we're going to sort of reenact that hearing as sort of a remembrance of the court's involvement in the process.
Yeah. Any questions? Any comments?
You so much for your story and the accounts that you've shared. Was there ever a moment when you considered the risks and the consequences of this civil rights work? And if there was, when was that moment? What was the conversation you had with yourself?
You know, it really, you know, it was nothing much worse than sort of be called a communist pinko or a nigger lover or a liberal or whatever else. And I was more fortunate than any other young lawyer in Memphis because I had a major legal figure and a mentor that had my back. And, you know, if I was doing this in another law firm or if I was doing it by myself, I wouldn't have had any practice after that. But I had this marvelous man who allowed me to do things that the community might not be 100% happy with, but it didn't affect my livelihood. And the other thing you have to remember is Memphis, but Memphis is not Mississippi, and it's not rural Alabama. And so when these freedom riders and the SNCC people and the voter registration, when they would leave the city limits of Memphis and hit the city limits or the state line in Mississippi across the road, they were entering into a very, very dangerous terrain. You do voter registration work in the middle 60s in Mississippi or rural Alabama, it's not at all unlikely that you could be killed or your house would be burned up. None of that happened in Memphis. It was a much more subtle, just you're not our kind of folks sort of a thing, but you know, that wasn't what I was about anyway. So it was never a problem. I tell you, I use this as an example. Of course, if Dr. King had not been killed, and it was just a lawsuit where we'd gotten represented him, there probably would have been more criticism then of representing Dr. King for our law firm than there was. Nobody could say anything after that. A year or so later, you know, I-40 goes all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast, but we've got a 100-acre park in the middle of Memphis called Overton Park. And our law firm kept the interstate from running through that park. And we got a lot more negative feedback as a law firm from stopping the interstate from going through the middle of Memphis and going around it than we did with this, or at least the people would tell you about it. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you again for your presentation, and this is the second time I've heard you, and as Rick said, I'd come hear you again. What was the result of the march? And then didn't I read recently that there have been some kind of reparations for families of garbage workers?
Yeah, immediately, almost immediately, once Dr. King was killed, the strike got settled. It got settled for what it could have been settled for before, but for the fact that we had a mayor that was so bullheaded that he would not negotiate or reach out, and he had a city council that we didn't have a majority of people that could override what the mayor was doing. But as soon as Dr. King was killed, they couldn't resist it. And so people came together and got benefits for the workers. And, you know, frankly, the sanitation department is 1,000 times better in Memphis than it was in those years. And some changes have been made. And again, this book I keep mentioning, and I bought it in 1967 before I'd ever had any involvement with Dr. King at all. But it's so prophetic, it's almost like that last speech that he made. He says in there that at the end of that book, he said, you know, the white people and the majority community didn't really have to pay very much to let us eat at the lunch counter or to ride on the bus or to vote or to do. It didn't cost them very much to do that. But where we are now, as he saw it in 1968, is the things that we need to do now to get real progress are going to cost something. You know, the schools are terrible. The economic disparity is awful. You know, we've got substandard housing. We've got huge drug problems. We've got a mass incarceration of black young men. Those things are going to cost people something to change, a lot more than it costs to allow a person to sit at the lunch counter. And that's what Dr. King was about at the end of his life. And frankly, living in Memphis today, that's what we're about now. Our schools are still segregated. We still have economic disparity. We have our prisons full of young black men. So, you know, it's an easy question to say, what do we do now? We get on to those hard issues, and they're going to be more difficult issues. And Dr. King, I think, knew they were going to be more difficult issues than just getting someone the right to vote. But thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so very much.
I'll ease up here.
Mr. Cody characterized himself as a witness, but every trial lawyer in the room knows that a good case can turn on the right witness. And we're thankful that you were a witness to these events and grateful that you took time to come and be with us this evening. Thank you so very much. The Hidden Legal Figures is a series of events that will promote our traveling exhibit that is being fabricated and developed this year and will premiere next year at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Our next event will be in April at Mercer Law School, where they'll do reflections on the career of Judge William Augustus Boodle. Judge Boodle was the federal judge that handled the desegregation of the University of Georgia and the desegregation of the public schools in Bibb County. In conjunction with our State Bar annual meeting, we'll focus on the career of Donald Lee Hollowell and C.B. King, and we'll round out the year in October at the University of Georgia School of Law. But as Rita mentioned, Emory was our first law school partner, and so very many thanks to Rita and Emory Law School for hosting this particular event. And as you can imagine, nothing like this is possible without the generosity of our colleagues. And so we want to say a special thank you to Jones Day for being the presenting sponsor for this evening. Could not have happened without them. And there are some members of the firm who are here, so if you would please stand and let everybody see the Jones Day personnel here this evening, we certainly would appreciate it. And as we know from headlines that scream out every day, it is important to remind the American citizenry that fidelity to the principle of the rule of law is not only important, but it's indispensable to a strong, vibrant, real democracy. And that's what we're doing at the Arc of Justice Institute, informing, inspiring, reminding, and renewing. Those simple principles is our focus. And we're so happy that you joined us this evening to take this first step. And again, we welcome you to the Arc. Good evening. Thank you.